This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, the governor tours the state promising a big tax cut, but some are saying the state is ignoring problems that have been mounting under his tenure. Will this Democratic gubernatorial candidate get some help from the state's Republican Party? The Attorney General admits she made a mistake for asking that an execution be delayed so she could hold a fundraiser, and the state health department will not be offering any assistance to those applying for Obamacare. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorai.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Angie Drobnik-Holan is editor of PolitiFact Florida. Brendan McLaughlin is news anchor and political reporter at WFTS 28 ABC Action News. Chris Ingram is a political analyst at Bay News 9 and a Republican. And Barry Edwards is a political strategist and a Democrat. Well, thank you for coming. Governor Rick Scott is traveling around the state calling for a cut of $500 million in taxes and fees from next year's state budget.
What I plan on doing next year is going to the legislature with $500 million worth of tax and fee reductions. Give back to families their money. We're going to invest the dollars we have at the state as wisely as we can to do the right things, whether it's water quality projects, make sure we do the right thing for education, all these things. We're also going to make sure when we have budget surpluses, we give some of it back to our citizens.
Among the proposals, cutting taxes on businesses and commercial real estate leases. For others, the possibilities include cutting car registration fees, property taxes, and a communication services tax. One other idea is to create another sales tax holiday. He was met by some educators who said if the state has more money, it should restore funding to schools. But the governor says he's helping schools already by backing a pay raise for teachers this year, and he said he's increased state funding to education by more than $1 billion each of the past 2 years since cutting it in 2011. So, Barry, is now the time for a tax cut?
Now is not the time for a tax cut.
Why not?
First of all, if we're going to run the state like a business, you need to run it like a business. And it's fiscally irresponsible when you've had cut after cut after cut and you've had to dip into all your reserves and drain them away to when you finally get some extra money coming in, not to plan for the future.
But the governor says he's restored $2 billion over the last 2 years
to education
and a pay raise for teachers.
He has done that, but let's look at the numbers. And Everett Dirksen said $1 billion here, $1 billion there adds up to real money. But when you look at it on a per student basis, in 2007 we spent $7,300 per student. Last year we spent $6,300. So even with the restoration, we're still $1,000 per student less. And let's look at some other things. Tuition for in the universities has gone up exponentially, which is a chilling effect on students college students in the state going to college. And almost every business survey that the Chamber's done and things like that I've ever seen said the number one reason why people don't come to Florida is the lack of our education system for a skilled workforce and our infrastructure system. And even if people aren't going to go to college, now's the time to invest in those things so they can be trained for the 21st century. And let's look at some other areas where we're not.
One more point. I want to go to Chris.
Too quick. The environment. Florida Forever. They're selling state lands to raise money. Affordable housing. They've swept the Sadowski Trust Fund. So it's a maybe fund rather than a trust fund. So I think now is not the time.
Chris, is now the time for a tax cut here in Florida? What do you think of what Barry just said?
I think it is the time. I think that it would be a further economic incentive to get our economy moving and growing again. Democrats always, on education, for example, they want to measure success in education based on how much money we spend. Republican view is let's measure it on how much our students actually learn. Dollars are not always the answer. You can do more with less. And I think that at this time we've seen that some of this reduced spending demonstrates how much largesse we were living off of over the previous 6, 7, or 8 years. And we can do more with less because government has just gotten way too big. So I support the governor's efforts.
What about Barry's point is as the population grows, our spending hasn't kept up. And I know what your point is that let's look at outcomes, not the money spent. But if Barry's numbers are right, that we're $1,000 behind where we started 4 years ago, Is that significant? Is that a significant cut to education?
Well, I think it's not insignificant, but I don't hear a whole lot of parents saying that my kids are suffering in the public schools because of lack of $1,000 on average per pupil spending. And I guess when we get to that point, maybe we need to evaluate, well, are the dollars sufficient to give our kids the education they need and deserve? But again, I don't think that the solution to the problems that our public education system faces are all solved by money. And that's just a philosophical difference that I think I and a lot of Republicans have with the Democrats.
Angie, what do you make of this debate over whether or not the governor should give tax cuts or invest more money in education and the environment?
Well, I think that we just heard a great summary of the debate. I would say that when we've looked very closely at all of the tax cuts that have happened under Governor Rick Scott, most of them have gone toward business. There's only a 2011 tax cut for homeowners. It was fairly small. I'm not sure how many people even noticed it on their tax bill. Now, Florida has been a low tax state. The recession drove down some people's property taxes. But I'm watching to see which way the governor is going to go. Is it going to be more tax cuts for business, or is he going to do something that maybe people feel in their pocketbook? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Brendan, the governor is going around the state, making 5 stops at some of the big cities around the state, just asking people what they think. What do you make of this?
Well, I get a kick out of the name, the It's Your Money Tour, because it really isn't your money. As soon as you pay it in taxes, it becomes their money or our money. So since taxes aren't voluntary, that's just the reality. I mean, this is the power of the incumbency with the governor. As the race, as the election approaches, he's got the purse strings to a certain extent that he can use this large S to do something that builds the electorate for him. Whether or not it benefits society is another question. But just because it may be sort of pandering on some level doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea.
Barry, this is undoubtedly the first step, or one of the first major steps towards the governor's reelection to kind of grab some headlines. And he's going to hammer this home. And he's saying to the Democrats, you guys have not come up with a response to what I'm suggesting.
And it's not just the Democrats, so let's make this clear, and independents in the state that are objecting to this. The Senate President Don Gates and the Appropriations Chairman in the House, Seth McKeel, I think his name is, they both said now may be the time to replenish our reserves that we've spent. Because if you don't replenish them now when you get extra revenues, when you have to cut again if the economy downturns, you don't have any reserves. And also, it's not just education that people like to focus on. Transportation. Their own transportation department said that we're $40 billion in a backlog for investment in construction. And that's just, and then what about doing the right thing, like on disabled children? There's 22,000 children waiting in Florida for community health.
There are all sorts of problems in this state that we could argue that are underfunded and in need of more dollars. But the fact of the matter is there is a limited supply of money to be taken from the people who earn it and then apply it in other places. And that, again, is just a philosophical, fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats. I'm not saying that needy children shouldn't have their issues addressed, but
Senate President Gates,
well, they said they may need to look at those things. That's not saying the same thing as they disagree with the governor.
All right, well, I can't wait for the session to happen and see how this debate turns out. Governor Rick Scott's top political advisor hinted this week that Republicans might help little-known gubernatorial candidate Nan Rich in next year's Democratic primary. Rich is a former state senator and the only announced Democrat running for governor, but she's not getting much traction. In the polls and the money race, she's not doing very well. But there are signs that Rich might get some help from the unlikeliest of places during next year's Democratic primary, supporters of Republican Governor Rick Scott. As the Miami Herald reported, Scott's top political advisor and pollster, Tony Fabrizio, hinted at the scheme this week when he made a speech to the Women's Republican Club of Miami. He said there could be what he called interested citizens who will help Rich and make it harder for Charlie Crist to win the primary. So, Chris, Fabrizio's really a smart guy. Is he going to do this?
I think they're playing around, and they want to keep her name in the news because it's good for the Republicans that the issues with Charlie, and you've got Bill Nelson looming out there, and will Alex Sink run or not? Look, one thing's for certain: Rick Scott would love to have Nan Rich as his candidate in a primary, or a general election rather, and he would love to have Charlie Crist in a general election because Charlie Crist is going to get the Republican base out to support Rick Scott that he can't do on his own. He will energize the Republican base to come out and be very, very enthusiastic about Rick Scott. So either one of these candidates, they're just chomping at the bit to have come November of next year. I don't think that's going to happen. I think eventually the Democrats are going to wake up and they're going to find a candidate off of their second-rate JV squad to come out and to be a more or less top-tier candidate
might
over
that
what
be?
they're facing
Any
right
names
now.
beyond
Well,
those that
again,
you mentioned?
I mentioned Bill Nelson, and I guess it really just comes down to a personal preference for him. Does he want his legacy to move from the Senate to Tallahassee? We have a historical precedent in the state of Democrat governors, Lawton Chiles and Bob Graham. One went from the Senate to the governorship, one from the governorship to the Senate. So, you know, the question is it's just a personal issue for Nelson, and I think when he realizes that they've got nothing else to offer as a choice that's legitimate in November against Rick Scott next year, I think he might do it.
All right, so Barry, what about Chris's point that the Republicans really, they'll take Chris, they'll take Rich, either one they think they could beat?
Well, I think Nan Rich is a credible candidate, and unfortunately she's not, for whatever reason, catching on. But I think to call U.S. Senator Nelson, CFO Sink, or former Governor Christ a second-tier candidate is inaccurate. Because if you look at the polls, which everybody's polls are consistent, Rick Scott's between 35 and 40% is favorable and a little over 50% unfavorable. And in every one of those second-tier candidates that you call them, he loses by 10 to 15 points and is lost now for 2.5 years. So now time is starting to tick away. There's only 14 months before. When does he start to come up?
I'll take Rick
to these
Scott's
second-tier
$70
candidates?
million and to say that he will beat any one of the
And
aforementioned
a final
candidates.
comment on that. If you look at California, Meg Whitman massively outspent Governor Jerry Brown. There's as you know, as a political consultant, there's a diminishing return on your spending. And everybody knows and has an opinion on Rick Scott and Charlie Crist, and that's the Republicans' problems, because Rick Scott is at a negative and Charlie Crist is at a positive, and to get people to change their opinion after all this time is very, very difficult.
Brendan, is there any precedent here in Florida where the other party has put up or helped a candidate because they want to hurt the other party's candidate in the primary?
Well, I think Chris might be right that this is probably more talk at this stage. But you know, if it did play out that way, if GOP surrogates or what have you started to fund Nan Rich to like weaken Charlie Crist or for whatever reason, I think they would look bad as sort of gaming the system and being sneaky. And Nan Rich would look bad for accepting money and appearing indifferent to the source of her campaign funds. The only person that would sort of look okay in that is Charlie Crist.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, Angie?
Let's talk about the money here. That Miami Herald report by Mark Caputo, it noted you need a minimum of $10 million to mount a credible state campaign. Rick Scott will probably have $70 million. Are Republicans really going to support Nan Rich to the tune of $10 million just for mischief's sake? I'll believe it when I see it. So I guess I'm siding with Chris here.
Okay. All right. Well, there was a controversy this week over delayed execution date. Attorney General Pam Bondi had asked Governor Scott to delay the execution of Marshall Lee Gore for the murder 25 years ago of a Miami woman. He was supposed to be executed this week. Bondi had asked for the delay so she could hold a fundraiser this week for her re-election campaign.
We try to, comply with when another cabinet member asks for something, we try to work with them.
Needless to say, the victim's family was upset. The governor said he wasn't aware of the reasons Bondi asked for the delay. When the media began to report the incident, the Attorney General issued a statement saying that asking for a delay was a mistake and that she should never have done it. Now the execution will take place October 1st. All right, Brendan, what does this say about Pam Bondi?
Well, in fairness, two things. One, these crimes took place in the 80s, and you can't really argue that it's justice delayed is justice denied in this case for another couple of weeks. Secondly, Pam Bondi immediately fell on her sword and sort of gave an unqualified apology, or at least said that she made a mistake and should not have done this. But I will say that apology probably should have been directed to the family of the victims and the two women that were killed. Their families, the parents of one of the girls, actually came to the prison in Florida from Ohio for the execution, which was then canceled because of procedural reasons. So they've already had that sort of heartache and lack of closure, and this certainly is something they did not need. So, again, it's her responsibility is to make that phone call the day of the execution to the governor to sort of say that there's no grounds to withhold this or to stop the execution. And I didn't quite understand why she couldn't do that at her fundraiser. Just step into a back bedroom. There might be some Bruno Mars music going on in the background, but she could still execute her responsibility.
Angie, what do you make of this?
I think it's unfortunate because I think it plays into the worst stereotypes that the public has about politicians, which is that, all they care about is raising money from special interests so they can hold on to power. I mean, it just looks so bad on its face. You just have to wonder if it was just a matter of maybe a harried aide making the schedule who just didn't stop to think twice. I mean, obviously we can't know, But this is the kind of thing that makes people lose confidence in government itself. So not a good thing.
Chris, did Bondi make up for it by admitting the mistake?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two learning lessons here. One, Pam needs to reassess kind of how her office is run and who's making these decisions. I tend to agree with you. I think this was probably more at the staff level than at the Pam Bondi, the Attorney General level, deciding to postpone this for a fundraiser. I don't think that happened. Give Pam the benefit of the doubt on that. The other learning lesson should be to all the other elected officials across the country who ever find themselves in the midst of a scandal, self-inflicted most times, that just come out and apologize, because Pam did the right thing by apologizing. She made this basically a 1-2 day story, as opposed to not apologizing, and the next thing you know, it's a 4 or 5 2-week story, 4 or 5 day or 2 week story, and people just start to pile on. But this will be forgotten a week from now. It's not going to really affect her re-election chances, and I think she'll learn from it.
Barry, I saw, though, this week that 3 big-name Democrats, their names were floated as running for Attorney General. Does this make her, I mean, despite what Chris said, does this make her a bit more vulnerable?
Absolutely. There's controversy, and whenever you have controversy and you see a chink in the armor, then people that may have been on the cusp of wanting to run are now willing to, because they think there might be other things you can exploit. But I think we also ought to look at the Republican legislature this year passed a bill to try to expedite executions, and Governor Scott signed it. And I put the blame on him. Why did he not ask her or her staff why she needed the delay?
Well, again, I think I would suspect this was a staff-to-staff level discussion. It wasn't Pam Bondi calling Governor Scott on a Friday night and saying, hey, I've got a fundraiser in a couple of weeks and reschedule that execution. I mean, that's preposterous.
You know, when the news came out about this fundraiser for Pam Bondi, the Republican Attorney General of the state of Florida, one name on that list of sponsors of this fundraiser jumped out, and that was Tampa's Mayor Bob Buckhorn, who's a Democrat. What should we read into Buckhorn's signing on to sponsor a fundraiser for the Republican Attorney General?
Well, I think he was sort of attending. I think he was just on the guest list. I don't know that he was really a sponsor in any way. And he was, you know, his response to that was that he's a Democrat third. I think he said he's a citizen first, mayor second, and a Democrat third. So that's the posture he's taken as a public servant here. And he's done that consistently through the RNC. He made a big point of saying this is not a partisan thing. This is about our community. So he ultimately did not attend the fundraiser, I think, is the bottom line.
And she's the hometown gal. I mean, they've known each other for years. You know, this would be different, I think, if this were some event for some candidate from Miami or something like that. I mean, I think it's wholly appropriate for him to support her.
You'd like to think he's going to attend the fundraiser for whatever Democrat perhaps runs against Pam Bondi as well.
Barrett, you guys in the Democratic Party have any problem with Buckhorn?
I think this is
his name being mentioned with Bondi?
Bob Buckhorn is a great mayor, and he's a great mayor who was elected in a nonpartisan race. And I think he looks at it as a nonpartisan. He has to unite all the citizens, and as he says, it doesn't take a Republican or a Democrat to fix a pothole. And so I think there's not that much to it.
Okay. Well, the state of Florida has issued an order that will prevent residents from finding out how they can sign up for expanded subsidized health insurance at county health departments. The directive bans the outreach activities of navigators or counselors who are hired under the Affordable Care Act to help low-income, uninsured residents sign up for the state's expanded insurance program. The order comes from Deputy Health Secretary C. Meade Grigg. It went out this week to the 60 local health department directors across the state. A spokesperson for the department says the Navigator program has raised privacy concerns because the information will be sent to a federal database. But federal representatives insist such fears are unfounded. Federal health officials say consumers will never be asked to provide their personal health information to the marketplace, whether through a navigator or not. And there is no such database of Americans' health information, and they say that independent fact-checkers have debunked the invasion of privacy claim. Well, Angie, speaking of fact-checkers, so have you guys looked into this? Are there privacy concerns for these navigators getting information from people signing up for Obamacare?
Well, people are signing up for health insurance, so this isn't like a checkup or anything like that. And I think it's the same level of concern that you would have for paying a bill over the internet. You know, you want to do your due diligence, but it's like people do that every day, and there's not tremendous problems with identity theft. You know, this is part of the course of doing business. Now, having said that, the Scott administration has opposed the federal health care law, so I think this is a piece of that. They really just don't want to give any assistance that they can credibly withhold. So, but what we're seeing is, it's interesting because, you know, it's playing out on the local level now. What we saw this week was Pinellas County is involved with these navigators, and they own the buildings where the health department is in much of Pinellas County. So the navigators are going to go in there.
They're going to be in the Pinellas County buildings, yeah?
And I would just add one other thing, like signing up for this insurance, it's not easy. It's kind of like filing your taxes. You know, it's technical. It's like, you know, how do you count your family and what's your modified adjusted gross income? You know, we've been answering questions in the Times, online and in print, every Thursday on this, because it's like, it's a topic that people just naturally have a lot of questions about. How does this work? Just basics. And that's what the navigators are doing, is trying to get the people signed up for health insurance. And there's a lot of forms and that sort of thing.
Chris, is the state being reasonable by saying to the county health departments, you can't sign people up here?
I don't really think it's unreasonable, but forget about that issue and forget about the fact that we're going to spend $67 million of federal tax money to show people how to sign up for health insurance and Obamacare. Let's look at that issue. That, to me, is the heart of the issue. If Obamacare is so complicated and so onerous that you have to go out and hire people to explain to people what they're signing up for, throw it out and let's start over.
Barry, what do you say then?
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think if you go and you actually try to sign up for health insurance or auto insurance and you actually read everything, there's a lot you have to do on faith, because my auto insurance had like a 25-page disclaimer. My health insurance is like a 50-page disclaimer. So I think it's very complicated if you're not an attorney or a CPA. So I think asking someone to be able to do that or providing that, and that's $67 million, I think, across the whole country.
No, what I'm saying, you're missing the point, Barry. Your complicated forms for your auto insurance and whatnot, and your tax forms and Obamacare forms, don't accept that it's so complicated. It shouldn't be that way. Throw it out and let's start over, because the thing's a train wreck.
Well,
Barry?
I'm depressed too. That it seems like, you know, we have a system already that's enormously complicated. Private insurance companies are no picnic to deal with. I mean, it's a nightmare, and it's a shame that the Obamacare addition to all this system, you know, does require your own navigator to figure out how to navigate this thing. You know, however you feel about, you know, the Canadian system, whether it's public or privately provided insurance, wouldn't it be nice to just go to the doctor and not have to worry about it?
And one more point of clarification. These navigators are helping people sign up for private health insurance sold by private companies that are really part of the existing system. The state rejected a Medicaid expansion, so now we're in this strange situation where the poorest of the poor in Florida are not going to have options to get health coverage. It's really, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of years.
Barry, what about Chris's point? Throw this whole thing out because it's too complicated. And I mean, I think with the Attorney General fighting Obamacare in the U.S. Supreme Court, everybody in state government is opposed to Obamacare.
The Republican elected leadership is opposed to it. But even in the Senate this year, they wanted to take the Medicaid expansion money. And I think Chris is saying it is complicated. But as Angie pointed out, this is helping the poorest of the poor use basically like a voucher to sign up and get a subsidy for their private insurance. So that's complicated. So we're going to have to start the whole system over.
It's creating another level of bureaucracy and of government. We're hiring people to explain to you what we can't explain to you because we made it so complicated.
What about Brenda's point? Let's just do a Canadian-style system. Not that you're supporting it. It's an option where you don't fill out any forms.
No, I don't think that's the appropriate way to go either. Okay. I don't have all the answers, but I know that this is not it.
All right. Well, before we go, we ask our panel members to tell us about one more major story from the past week. Brendan, your other big story.
Yeah, well, George Zimmerman, who was acquitted in the death of Trayvon Martin, during that trial, the question was sort of, is he a racist? Was he motivated by racism? But the way he's conducted himself with this confrontation with his estranged wife and her father, where they had an altercation, the police were called, and he was accused of punching Dad in the face and threatening his estranged wife with a gun. I think we can conclude that he may or may not be a racist, but he is a jerk. And I checked on this. That is not even a misdemeanor in Florida.
All right, Barry, your other big story.
Up in Pasco County, there's a special election for the vacated seat for Senator Fasano. He is now the new tax collector. And I think everybody on both sides thought that he was going to warmly embrace the Republican candidates for his seat. Well, in the first interview I saw in the St. Pete Times, he said he really wasn't satisfied with any of them in the responses. Then there was a debate on health care, and he said none of them really embraced affordable health care. And now he's hinting that he may actually endorse the Democrat. So I'm actually predicting that he will endorse the Democrat. If he endorses the Democrat, Amanda Murphy, she's going to be a new powerhouse Democratic elected legislator, and her chief staffer, Brian Goff, are just the new generation of Democratic leaders in Florida.
Chris, your other big story.
You know, the most dangerous place in Polk County is anywhere between Grady Judd and a camera. But Grady Judd did the right thing this week when he arrested Pastor Terry Jones, who was going to go out and burn Korans. And I think he did the right thing. I actually had the chance to speak to Mr. Jones today, and I told him I support his First Amendment right to do what he's doing, although I disagree with it. And, of course, he's got to do it in a manner that doesn't endanger the health, safety, and welfare of the public, which is why he got arrested. And as Brandon pointed out to me earlier, it was a felony, not just a misdemeanor. But I asked Mr. Jones this question: what would Jesus do? Would he approve of what you're doing here today? And I fully expected him to pause and think about that and hopefully honestly say no, he would not. But he believes the garbage that he is espousing, that, yeah, this is something Jesus would do. And we need to send him the message that it's inappropriate and it should not be tolerated in our society. And good for Grady Judd, he did.
All right, and Angie, your other big story?
My big story is Syria and the potential military strikes against Syria. Ultimately, a congressional vote was delayed. But before that, we saw some really interesting responses from our Florida congressional delegation. Marco Rubio, who has really developed a reputation as a hawk, said no, he was against it. Meanwhile, we had the head of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, was supporting Obama. And then back here in Tampa, Kathy Castor, who's usually, very much supportive of the president, she was a no vote too. So we saw really interesting mixed up political positions there.
That was absolutely right. Angie, thanks a lot. Chris, thank you. Barry, thank you. And Brendan, thank you. And thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can record your comment on our toll-free line. It's 1-800-335-9338. Or write us at ftw@wedu.org. And you can watch the program online on the wedu.org website beginning on Monday. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.